Thank you. Okay, I've been busy since the last Scrum Day trying to write down for people. We wrote this book, Twice the Work in Half the Time. How many of you are getting twice the work in half the time? It's good, we have some people. How many of you are getting twice the work in half the time at scale? That's harder, okay? So Scrum at Scale is not just another scaling framework. It's how we get twice the work in half the time at scale, right? Because that's real scaling, being able to take one team. You had 2 teams, you get twice the production. You have 4 teams, you have four times the production. 100 teams, you have 100 times the production, right? That's scaling. And it's very difficult to do without setting it up right. And we even got the Harvard Business Review to publish a paper on Agile at scale. So we've been working hard at publishing. Joe Justice has been doing the hardware work. Avi in the middle here is in China, not in China. He's sometimes, usually in Asia. He's currently in Japan. We have a joint venture in Japan that's exploding out the Scrumming style of patterns-based training around getting twice the work in half the time. And we've also created another company, a subsidiary of Scrumming, called Scrum at Scale, for the specific purpose of, we've been in negotiations with the Scrum Alliance for the last year, and they wanted to participate, have ownership and feedback into a scaling framework. So we sold them half of Scrum at Scale. So now we have a joint venture that's going to be a Scrum Alliance's certifying body for training trainers and certifying Scrum at Scale. Recently, Jim Copeland did a talk at GoTo, and I thought he did a good job of clarifying the lineage of Scrum and Agile. Because I talked to some people, they think Scrum comes from Agile. That's not the way it works, okay? And actually, Jim clarified my mind, too. I often say Scrum comes from Lean, but Scrum doesn't come from Lean. Lean came later. And Professor Nanaka and Takeuchi, who we work closely with, constantly remind me, they never talk about Lean. That's a Western thing. They talk about the Toyota production system and the way the Japanese have implemented practices that the Western world has adopted as Lean. So the lineage of Scrum is through Takeuchi Nanaka studying Toyota and other similar companies. That is where the name Scrum came from. And what I brought into it was all a decade of experience with object-oriented tools and technologies, and particularly small teams, rapid refactoring, continuous integration, pair programming, all of the XP practices we were doing all through the 1980s, and it wasn't until 1996 that actually XP was formalized. And it was really Scrum and XP, the founders were 7 of the 17 people at the Agile Manifesto meeting. It was those 2 processes that were main point of discussion. So they're the parents of the Agile Manifesto. And a lot of people say they're Agile, and they imply that that's a process for implementation. And Agile has nothing to do with implementation. It's a set of values. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about today is that if I go to Silicon Valley, 80% of the teams that claim to be Agile cannot deliver a working product at the end of a sprint. So there's a lot of stuff that is called Agile that isn't Agile. Right? How many of you can deliver working features at the end of a sprint? Pretty good number. Better than Silicon Valley, I think. You're about 30%. So the other thing I've been talking about lately is some of the history of Scrum. It really I didn't make this up, okay? This all comes from brilliant thinkers, huge amounts of data, all starting back with my experience at West Point, then through the Air Force, then in medical research, and particularly doing medical computing, working with Bell Labs and understanding how Bell Labs built software and scaled it. You know, because in the 1970s, Bell Labs was deploying every week a new upgrade in 42 countries with no downtime. And we think that's innovative that we're doing this today, right? No, this has been done before. And when I looked at what the people at Bell Labs were doing, I was working with Craig Ritchie and Kernighan, and who invented Unix and invented the C language. And I watched what they were doing. I looked at that and I said, the average person will never figure this out. It's not obvious, it's counterintuitive. We need to write it down in a way that the average person can implement it. And I don't have time to talk more about this right now, but from the point of view of scaling Scrum, we have the problem of numbers of teams, but also distributing teams all over the world. But Scrum at Scale is also seriously interested in scaling an entire organization. In fact, the primary objective is to generate organizational performance that drives market share, company valuation, and profitability. Since 2006, I've worked with a venture capital group that basically implemented Scrum at Scale. I mean, for them, it means every single person in the company is on a Scrum team doing Scrum. No one is doing anything else. That's Scrum at Scale. And we want our companies that we invest in to do that. Why? Because we want to take a company like ExactTarget, which we invested like $10 million, and we want to sell it for $2.7 billion to Salesforce.com. That is the effect of Scrum at Scale that we're looking for, okay? So it's not about IT, it's about how do you get performance of an organization. And the other thing that's interesting about scaling is that if you cannot get a well-performing Scrum team, they don't scale. And by that I mean as you add teams, the productivity per team decreases. This is the norm, actually. This is what normally happens. It's what happens 100% of the time in the waterfall. In fact, it wasn't until 2009 that we actually published an IEEE paper. When it was peer-reviewed, they said, you know, you guys sound like you're writing about productivity, but this is the first paper in the history of computer science that generated you can double the number of teams globally, and the production went up by more than a factor of 2. So there's something about what you were doing and the way you were implementing it that was really unique, okay? So that's what I want to talk about. How do you get, the other interesting thing that's happened to me, I get a lot of kickback, even from many of the certified Scrum trainers at the Scrum Alliance. They complain about me talking about velocity all the time. And that we should be talking about value. But the problem with that, particularly from a venture capital point of view, is that if the pipe of delivery is small, you can't squeeze the value through the pipe. So the first order of business when we invest in a company is to open up the pipe. And we can actually do that quite quickly with a patterns-based Scrum training for the management and the teams. And then we spend 80% of our time getting the value equation right. So it's not that we're not looking for value, but that we can't get it. If we can't get velocity, we sell the company off. They can't compete, they can't deliver, we can't we can't make any money that way. So you'll hear me talking a lot about opening up the pipe to let the value out. So in the paper that was published last month, there's a brand new paper in the Harvard Business Review. It's the third Scrum paper that's been published ever in the Harvard Business Review. The second one we published 2 years ago, and the first one was by Takeuchi Tanaka in 1986. Would scaling up improve corporate performance as much as Agile methods improve individual team performance? Okay, that's scaling. Can we improve corporate performance and make it look like a high-performing Scrum team? That's the question. When I was talking to the leaders of Intel's Scrum, Intel had the largest number of people doing Scrum in any one company, about 30,000 people, and trying to train another 200,000. Now there's actually a bigger one. Lloyd's of London is doing a Agile transformation of 70,000 people. And the leadership of that transformation came through our Train the Trainer program for Scrum at Scale. They said the biggest problem they have at Lloyd's is kumbaya Scrum. Any of you guys doing kumbaya Scrum? That's where everybody gets around and hugs each other and has a good time, but doesn't deliver anything. Well, you can't. What the Intel guys told me was, Jeff, what we've learned at Intel is nothing scales. You can't put 1 billion transistors on a chip unless every component has the same model as every other component on the chip. And they said the same is true of the internet, and the same is true of Scrum if it's implemented properly. So they said, you know, when you write down Scrum at Scale, don't screw it up. Okay. So scale-free architecture. What's that? I was at Boston University last Friday, and the dean gave me an award and a little talk, and all he talked about was scale-free architectures. He said, the last 10 years, we've been building out a new network structure for the internet that is really scale-free because there's some bottlenecks in the current way the internet is structured. And he told all the project managers in attendance, he says, the same technology architectural principles that we're applying to make the internet scale-free is exactly what I'm talking about when you're scaling Scrum. You have to have the same kind of architecture. And if you study biological systems, which is where Scrum comes from the medical research and the work I did with Bell Labs, there's a lot of scale-free architectures in biology. We have a whole bunch of them sitting here in the room. Every one of you have billions of cells, and they're all the same, right? And they organize themselves into components, and the components all interact, and you show up. It's a miracle that it actually works, right? Well, interestingly, as we started to write down about Scrum at Scale, it really actually all started back in 1983 at a big bank. A big bank came by and pulled me out of the university. They said, Jeff, you have the best teams and technology in the university. You have all the knowledge there. And over at the bank, we're having a lot of trouble. But we have all the money, so why don't we put the money together with the knowledge? It would make a perfect marriage. And they gave me an offer that my wife couldn't refuse. So I wind up at the bank as vice president to advanced systems. As I walked into the bank, I had a grant from the Kellogg Foundation I was working on, a leadership grant. So it required me to spend a third of the time traveling around the world with 50 other key people. 6 of the 7 of the group were business school professors, and these are the guys I hung out with. And so when I came into the bank, I looked at, I was responsible for new technology, but I was looking at the old stuff they were doing. They had these big Gantt charts on the walls, and all their projects were late, and they were working nights, and they were working weekends. And they remind me of rowers on a Roman galleon, row harder. Management is cracking the whip. We're going to have more meetings, and we're going to have more reports. And everything they were doing was making it slower. So I actually brought the business school professors into the bank, and I said, what should we do with this? And they said, you really need to create a whole new operating model within the bank, a new organizational structure. You need to create a startup inside this big company. And at that time, this book was one of the best sellers. It had some basic principles that were implemented in the best companies, starting with small teams. And so I went into the CEO's office and I asked him if he had noticed that all his projects were late. And he said that, yeah, the customers who were CIOs of banks, we were actually running 150 banks all over North America, were calling him up every day and screaming at him. And I said, well, I think I know how to fix this. And he wanted to know how. I said, to do it, we need to take a complete unit, a business unit of the bank, and create a completely different, like a little company within the company with a new operating model. And to do that, you're going to have to give me everyone, sales, marketing, support, installation, people writing software, everyone. And I said, if you give me that unit, we will implement a practice where every Monday morning, product management will come in and prioritize the backlog by business value, and every Friday afternoon, everything will be live. Doesn't matter whether it's a sales proposal, it will be shipped. If it's software, it's running for all the banks, all 150 banks. And he said, well, that sounds like it's not going to be a lot of fun, like the job you have right now, working on new technology. I said, I don't care. This bank is totally broken. It needs to be fixed. He said, okay, you got it. So that was the beginning of the first prototype of Scrum. I've talked through that slide. The basic principles for driving it, all focused on action, all getting close to the customer, autonomous teams, which are the basis of Scrum, entrepreneurial, everybody, all teams in the organization having an entrepreneurial mental attitude, radically improvement of productivity through building great teams, part of the first principle in the Agile Manifesto, hands-on, everybody's hands-on, delivering something, simple structure, lean staff, simultaneous loose-tight properties. The loose-tight properties is the management style. I was talking to the managers of a big oil company today, and they said, our biggest problem is we have to give up control, but they don't understand how it works. As investors, we don't give up control. We actually have a significant amount of power. We can change the whole management team on any given day if we want to. So we don't give up control. But we do not micromanage the teams. We agree on goals. We ask what you need. What do you need? We give them money. They agree to make transparent the results. If the results are good, we give them more money, and if they're bad, we shut them down. Okay, so this is the way a managers of Scrum teams should think, right? It's not about just giving away the farm. It's about setting up an environment where people are encouraged and enabled to perform well. And the small cross-functional teams, I had learned from Brian Kernighan at Bell Labs that it's really important that there be no specialization and no specialized titles. Specialized talent, that's good, but no titles. So we want to get rid of all the titles. And working production prototypes in short iterations really fast, okay? That's what I learned from Bell Labs. Like every week we want something new that works. So the small teams were set up like this. I think I mentioned everything. Everything's done on Friday. Monthly business unit retrospective and planning. Okay, so this big room planning thing that everybody's talking about today was all started in 1983. I told the teams, I'm going to show you how to land a project just like I train new fighter pilots to land the aircraft. So this is an F-4 that I used to fly. And these planes are designed to land on aircraft carriers. So you smash them on the end of the runway to absorb the energy and slow it down. So I said to the teams, I'm going to give you a burn down chart. We're going to throw away the Gantt chart. And you'll be able to look at your glide path coming down into Friday afternoon to land the project. And I said, I know you're going to screw it up for a few weeks, but just like a new pilot, we're going to circle around and we'll come back in and we're going to try it again. And we're going to do that over and over again until we can nail it. And it took them about 6 weeks to get a proper landing. And the effect of that was within 6 months, they were the most profitable business unit in the bank. So they went from 30% loss, negative margin, to 30% net profit, 60% swing in margins in 6 months, using this first prototype of Scrum at scale. So then we take that into companies today. So back in 2009, we booted up Pegasystems, a publicly traded company. And while they had hundreds of people in the United States and Cambridge, MIT area, and hundreds of people in India. And while we're booting it up, the stock price goes up 400%. That's what we like to see. Then we left, and they got distracted buying companies. When you do that, all of a sudden you have money to buy companies, and you have a lot of work getting organizations to work. And I kept on telling them, you guys, you have a good Scrum implementation, but it's not great. You need to constantly improve. The biggest problem with Agile transformations is people get some improvement and then they stop. And when you do that, your stock price flatlines. And it wasn't until several years later that they brought me in to work with the product owners. And then immediately, the stock price goes up 4x again, see? The beauty of this is 8x is what you get on a really high-performing Scrum team. And if you can scale Scrum, you get that on the stock price of the organization, okay? So this is the thinking behind Scrum at scale. How do we take one Scrum team and have many that work as well as one? Now, to do that, the leadership really needs to understand the numbers. So recently we were working with Maersk, the biggest shipping company in the world, and their problem was the price they could get for a shipping container averaged about $600, but it was costing them $1,400. So they were losing $800 on every shipping container. And half of their company was oil, and they were losing money. Anytime the price of oil went below $40 a barrel, they were losing money. So they restructured the company, split it apart, got a new CEO, and then they said, Jeff, come on in and talk to the shipping company, the senior management. So as I was meeting with them, I was thinking about how to approach talking about Scrum. The first thing I said was, if you could do twice the work in half the time, then instead of $1,400 a shipping container, you'd be down to $300 or $400. Now your margins would be 50%. You'd probably put all your competition out of business. So Scrum could solve your problem, but it will only solve your problem if you understand the numbers. And I asked if anybody had read the book Moneyball. Anybody read Moneyball in here? Not too many, okay. Moneyball is a book about baseball. And the Oakland A's, a team out in Washington State, were losing most of their games, and they hired a statistician. The statistician came in and looked at the numbers, the statistics on baseball, and he said, you know, most of the runs in baseball are achieved by people just getting to first base. The people that hit home runs, they get runs, but they don't get most of them. So if we just hired people that got to first base, we don't have much money, we could save a lot of money and get a lot more runs. And they did that, and within a year, they had the second highest, they went from one of the worst in the league to the second highest win rate, and the average salary, they're significantly less than average in salary. So I said to Maersk, I want to talk to you about the Moneyball of Scrum. This is what you need to understand at the senior management level. The first thing you need to know is that every time we go into an organization and we prioritize at the enterprise level, we find that 30% of the projects on the list should not be done because they don't have a reasonable return on investment. We even booted up a restaurant in London. I'm going to London in a week to do Scrum at Scale training. We have a restaurant, Ricardo's Restaurant. It's run completely by Scrum. As soon as he had the Scrum teams do the shift planning, he found a third of the shifts weren't necessary. We went into GE, Silicon Valley operation. They had 1,000 developers. They wanted us to audit them. We audited them. We found 30% of the teams were working on stuff the business didn't want. And as soon as they heard that, they wanted them to stop. Okay? So I call this the dark work. The stuff that people just make up that saps the lifeblood of the operation. Okay? So the first step is for the leadership team to be able to prioritize, to get rid of the dark work. Now, the stuff that we have left that might be useful, we have huge amounts of data over the last 30 years in software, and we're seeing the same thing emerge in hardware. 65% of the features are never or rarely used. So the job of the product owner's Scrum is stop building that. I mean, I recently rented a brand new, I have a Tesla, okay? When I walk up to my Tesla, the door opens up automatically. I get in and I sit down, I put my foot in the brake, it starts up. I put it in drive and off we go. So I rented a brand new Prius in Washington. I walk up to the door, it doesn't open up. I get in the car, I can't figure out how to turn it on. I look around, I finally find this on button, so I push that. But then I can't figure out how to get it into drive. They have some weird thing you have to do. I finally get it into drive, but now I'm worried about, is there some emergency brake I have to deal with? Because the Tesla does that all automatically. We don't have to worry about that, but now I'm worried. This must be this must be a 1950s style car where you actually have to have an emergency brake. So I have to make sure that that's not working. That's hard to figure out. But finally, after 5 or 10 minutes of struggling, I get out of the parking place. I get to where I'm going. I stop. I get out, just like I do with my test. So I start walking away, and then I realize the car is still on. You know, I'm 20 yards away from the car. I have to walk back, get in. Now I have to figure out, how do I turn this thing off? There is no off. There's only an on button. So I said, well, maybe if I push the on button, it will go off. And it does. But now I'm really worried. Does it turn the lights off, or is it going to run out the battery on me? So I have to mess around with the light switch and make sure the lights are on. I finally get out, and now, what kind of customer am I of Toyota? A really frustrated customer, a bit angry about those people that put all these useless features on the car. And because of all those useless features, I will probably never buy one. So it's not just that you're wasting money, you're really aggravating the customer, okay, by this useless stuff. So if we can get rid of at least some of that, we made some forward progress, then we can focus on, okay, of the stuff the customers will use, how effective is the team? So for the last 2 days, we've really been talking more about that, right? And we've been ignoring the 30% of dark work that's going on in your organizations. And we haven't been talking about, have we talked about getting rid of 2/3 of the features you're building in the last 2 days? This should come first, even before you talk about the teams, right? Otherwise, you're having the teams wasting their time, okay? Now, when it comes to the teams, we're interested in efficiency, right? Germans are always interested in efficiency, I found out. But the only efficiency we're interested in is process efficiency. That's a lean concept. And to be lean, your process efficiency needs to be over 25%. And it's defined as the value-added work divided by the calendar time to deliver. So if you have a story in your backlog that should take a day, how many days does it take to get to done in your Scrum tooling? Anybody know that? On the average. Well, at GE, they know because they have I6 Sigma lean experts. It's 5%. That means a day of work takes 20 days to get it done. And if you go back and this number, how many are using Jira in this room? Yeah, almost all of you. The data is sitting there in Jira. All you have to do is run the number. You'll see the process efficiency of your team. I'm working with a PhD student in Netherlands right now. We're publishing a paper on process efficiency of Scrum teams. It's a really important number because if you can make that number go up, the production will go up. So if the process efficiency is 5% and only 25% of the staff is producing something useful, then the organizational capacity for delivery is 1.25%. And if we can drive that up to 5%, we've already got twice the work in half the time, right? So how hard is it to drive that up? Okay, I was working with an Indian team recently, and they asked me, what KPIs should we have with our Scrum team? I said, the only one that matters is process efficiency. And it's in your Scrum tool, so just make it, calculate it, and put it on the front page of your tool. So every time you open it up to look at your backlog, you have the number. So they put it in the tool, and the very first sprint, they're doing a 2-week sprint, they booted up the first day, it's running at 5%. Within 3 days, they got it to 80%. By the end of the 4th day, they were done with everything in the sprint. So what that means is an Indian team remotely can do twice the work in half the time in 4 days. That's all it takes. You could go back to work tomorrow, and by mid-next week, you would be there. But you need to know the numbers. So the good news is it's so easy conceptually to do this. Now, if you're able to get this right, it's really interesting what's going on in the United States right now. I was saying, I think I had my Scrum training deck. Amazon has 1,000 teams, and they deliver every 11 seconds. Because I had done training at Amazon, I knew they had 1,000 teams, and I had a deck from an Amazon head of engineering from 2011 said 11 seconds. And my coaches internally said, Jeff, you shouldn't say that. That's too aggressive. That's too, it's not believable. You need to prove it. Prove it to us that they can do that. So I talked to the head of the Agile practice at Amazon, who I work with. I said, hey, I'm getting kickback from my staff about the 1,000 teams in the 11 seconds. Can you check that out for me? He said, well, Jeff, first of all, we have 3,300 Scrum teams. The 1,000 we talked about are just the ones in Seattle. And I will get back to you within an hour because I will run the numbers on our deployment system. And within the hour, he says, we're deploying more than once a second. So 3,300 Scrum teams are deploying a new feature more than once a second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of a year. And what this means is that if they go into any market, they totally crush the opposition. They recently bought a supermarket, Whole Foods, and the stock price of every major supermarket started to tank the very next day. And all the executive says, it's not fair. It's not fair that Amazon could do business in our space, that we should be able to be legacy waterfall and still collect our paycheck. I was listening to a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, and he was saying the same thing is true of the aerospace industry. They're saying it's not fair that SpaceX is delivering at 20% of the cost. And companies like Boeing said to the government, well, yeah, we haven't innovated in the last 50 years, but if you give us $4 billion, then we'll use that money to figure out how to do something like SpaceX. Okay, so we have all these legacy companies out there that think it's okay to be like they are. Well, guess what? Anybody that has to compete with Amazon, it's game over unless you can do what they're doing. And there's only one company that can do that right now. Walmart has invested huge amounts of money in a service that can provide you stuff as cheap or cheaper than Amazon and as fast as Amazon. So it definitely is possible, but it requires really skillful execution at scale. Okay, so scaling Scrum is important. Another thing that is really critical that many companies don't realize, how many of you are doing deployment every day? Few of you, okay. Microsoft can do that now with all of their development tools. Ken and I started working with them in 2005. In 2017, they said, we're delivering every day now. And David Rico wrote a paper on the return on investment of going from letting your customers find your bugs to actually having an automated system that can detect them, that can deliver every day, and the return on investment is 73,000%. So for every dollar you invest in this, you wind up getting thousands of dollars back. But I talked to so many companies like big banks, Now we're working with a lot of oil companies. Oh, you know, if we had to deliver faster, that would cost us more. That's what they think. No, if you do it right, it actually costs you less. And you really need to figure out that quickly, because the return on investment is so huge that people that do it, their profitability, their margins is so much bigger than yours that it's not long-term survival depends on you walking this road as fast as possible. I recently got an update from Jim Johnson, the Standish Group CEO. They've been publishing data, they call it the Chaos Report, every year for over 20 years. And he gave me the latest update. We met in a coffee shop in Cape Cod. And he says, here's my latest report. It's a summary data from 2013 to 17, I think. And the good news is that the numbers have gone up, even for waterfall. But he said, what is of real interest, he says, I've been trying to figure out why Scrum works. And so for the last 3 years, I've been analyzing my database of over 50,000 projects, trying to figure out what really differentiates, what is the biggest differentiator between success and failure. And he says, what I've found is that the biggest difference is what I'm calling decision latency. How long does it take to make a decision? And for companies whose average turnaround for decision time is an hour or less, the success rate is 58%, which is significantly higher than the Agile success rate. So he said, really what we need to focus on is how fast can you turn around a decision. Now this is really important to scaling. One of the reasons we get better decisions with Agile is we push stuff to the teams and they can turn around a decision in 10 minutes. Then if we have good product owners who can turn around a decision in less than an hour, they're close enough to the team to turn around a decision in less than an hour, it keeps that decision latency down. And then if we have a leadership team that can turn around a decision in a day or less, in a few hours, it can give that average decision latency, it can keep it down to an hour. But what we have in the so-called scaled Scrum out there is leadership teams not doing Scrum. So they drive decision latency up. So the typical scaled Scrum will wind up over here, not over here. So this is an interesting, it's not a piece of data, it's an interesting massive chunk of data. So it's our bureaucratic processes create poor decision latency. Yeah. Things that require sign-offs make stuff not get done. Layers upon layers of management make decision latency increase. This is the major reason that Nokia went out of business for a while and lost the phone business. So in order to scale, we need a minimum viable bureaucracy. So what is the absolute minimal bureaucracy that we need to assure that as we scale, things are properly coordinated? Well, it turns out we really only, if we look at what's going on, I was in, when I was at the Scrum Alliance gathering a couple of months ago, I had 500 people in the room. And I said, how many of you are in an organization like this, where you have waterfall management trying to get Agile running down at the team level, and they want all their standard waterfall reports? How many are in that situation? It's better, because at Scrum Alliance, everybody raised their hand. So 500 people, everybody raised their hand. I said, and many of you have a translation layer called the scaling framework that's designed to protect the management from the agility. And this is going to increase decision latency and radically increase failure rate. It doesn't eliminate the dock work. It doesn't eliminate useless features. It doesn't get twice the work in half the time. And it doesn't get linear scalability. So when I say scaling, scaling means you can do these 4 things when you add more teams. So one piece of the medical viable bureaucracy we find is we absolutely must have a leadership team that can rapidly respond to problems in the organization with the Agile ecosystem and turn a fix around in a few hours. We have many case studies now, and actually the best one I've seen is actually in the oil business. How long does it take to drill an oil well? They've learned how to drill wells in twice as many in half the time. And they said the primary reason is the senior management team meets every day and turns around a solution to problems in 2 or 3 hours when it used to take 2 or 3 weeks. So if you don't have a leadership team that can do that, you can't scale. So we call that it doesn't matter what you call it, we call it in the Scrum and Scale framework, an enterprise action team. It's action oriented. And on the product owner side, the product owners have to be prioritizing everything, but also meeting with the stakeholders, particularly the management, on regular cycles, and making sure the leadership of the organization is aligned with the backlog. Because the second biggest problem after having nobody in charge is having somebody in charge, but people messing with the backlog when the teams are trying to execute. If people mess with that backlog, you can't scale. So SAP, which has more than 2,000 teams, has told us, Jeff, scaling won't work unless the product owner organization is meeting at least once every sprint with management at their level to align with the backlog. So we need an executive action team, and we need a product owner organization that aligns the management with the backlog. So what we see with stable and sustainable Agile implementations, whether it's SAP, which is pretty good, Microsoft, which is better, Salesforce, which is quite good, Spotify, which is actually changing right now its model because they have so many teams. They all have the management supporting the ecosystem and the teams driven by what we call in Scrum at Scale the MetaScrum, the team of product owners. So we need 3 Scrum teams. That extra bureaucracy is Scrum, so we have the same component model. And that is all we need to scale to thousands of teams. And if you have any more than that, it's going to cripple linear scalability. Okay. So what we want to do is to scale the Scrum Master. We want to take and have multiple teams and a Scrum of Scrums. But what we're clarifying here is that the Scrum of Scrums is a team of teams. And that team of teams needs to have a daily meeting to figure out what they've been doing, what they're going to do, how they're going to deliver at the end of a sprint all together, a unified, shippable increment of product. And that is not just the Scrum Masters. It's whoever needs to be there to ensure you have a shippable increment at the end of a sprint. And they have, so that daily meeting they have, we're calling a scaled daily meeting. And if it scales up, like we have, we're working with 3M globally, many business units, you get situations like, or many divisions. You get within a division, you'll have many business units, and they'll have their own Scrum of Scrum scaling up. There'll be an enterprise action team at the top, making sure the whole ecosystem for the division is functioning properly. On the product owner side, we want a similar picture. Every team has a product owner. There's a team of product owners we call the MetaScrum that's coordinating the flow of backlog into the teams such that you have a unified, shippable increment of product at the end of a sprint. And it scales up. It's all the same. It's fractal in nature. Every node looks like the same as every other node. So if you have an organization that, again, here's a division at 3M. It has an executive MetaScrum. One of the best ones we've implemented has Scrum everywhere. Every single person on the division is in a Scrum team, including HR and all these other departments. They're all Scrum. And the chief executive assumed the role of the chief product owner for the division. And she met with her team of product owners twice a week, running weekly sprints. In fact, here's the picture of their organization. And they have knowledge teams. They have a lot of PhD, MD knowledge experts working on particularly AI processing of clinical documents. So they meet as virtual teams, setting standards and technical direction, but these people are all deployed onto the Scrum team. So everybody's deployed onto a Scrum team, and they have these virtual teams. These are for infrastructure that meet regularly, making sure we have the expertise, the training, the standards for that piece of the infrastructure. The other thing we're trying to do with Scrum at Scale is make sure we implement a lot of the things we've learned from Professor Cotter over the years. He's a leading change guy at Harvard. And his book, Leading Change, talks about you can't do it unless you have a leadership team that drives the change. So it's not just me saying you have to have this. Harvard says you have to have this. Why? Because Professor Cotter says 80% of change processes fail, and they almost 100% fail if you don't have a leadership team leading the change and participating in that change. So here's the data that Jim gave me on Agile projects. It's a little better. Back in the previous 2011 to 2015 data, the success rate for waterfall projects was 11%. Now it's up to 26%. I think it's largely driven by getting smaller projects. I'm almost done, Arlene. Relax. Okay. I think this is the last slide. So time to make a decision is the primary metric for success. And a well-implemented Scrum pushes decisions down to the lowest level. And strong, decisive product owners, empowered product owners, are critical And the three things I'm talking about, making the Scrum of Scrums working, the MetaScrum working, and the Enterprise Action Team working, are essential to drive rapid decisions that are the primary driver of project success. And so with Scrum at Scale, we've tried to make that happen. Those of you who are interested, you can go to our website and find out more about it. So that's it.